Heat pumps can seem kind of mysterious. I mean, we put 1 unit of energy, of electric energy in, and we get something like 4 units of heat out. It almost feels like cheating. And to really understand this, I wanted to simulate a heat pump on an atomic level for a long time. And I'm really curious if that's going to work. Otherwise, that's really going to challenge my understanding of thermodynamics. From my entropy defying messages app, I still have this basic atom collision code lying around. And I really hope that we can turn this into a working heat pump. A heat pump is basically just this quite simple cycle, and we're going to need these 4 elements: a pump, an area where the compressed medium can release heat, an expansion valve, and hopefully the cold area where on the other side of this expansion valve, this medium flowing through this cycle should extract heat from the surrounding. To build such a cycle, we need some way to introduce barriers in the first place. Basically, whenever an atom comes close to the barrier, we have to apply a force to push it back. Generally, this simulation code is just a continuous loop where in each step we calculate the forces acting on all atoms, we update the velocities accordingly, and then we update the positions. And now, to integrate some barriers or walls into this simulation, we have to integrate forces for these walls into this loop. I think all we need to do that is this normal vector, not very normal. And whenever an atom comes close to the line beneath a given threshold, we can apply a force in the direction of the normal vector. Okay, so let's see if that works. I guess it kind of works, but of course I don't want the atoms to be reflected beside the start and the end point of the line. To fix that, I guess we can simply check if the closest point on the line is between the start and the end point. The simple if statement should do the trick. I guess I kind of made it worse. Now, the atoms can actually pass next to the barrier, but there's something weird going on. You can see it if you look at the tips of the line. And over time, the atoms become faster and faster. This barrier clearly doesn't conserve energy, but it should. Okay, so that's the situation right now. I think here in the middle, everything's fine. When an atom is approaching the barrier, it's slowed down by the forces that we're applying, and then it's accelerated back out. But something nasty is happening down here at the ends. Atoms can essentially sneak up on the barrier without feeling any force, and then they're accelerated out on the other side. Every time that happens, the atom essentially gets a free energy snack without having paid anything to approach the barrier before. It's a perpetual motion machine, essentially. So we clearly have to take better care of the ends. So in my hopefully final implementation, I don't want to use the normal vector always, but instead I want to determine the closest point on the line between start and end, so this here for example, and then apply the force in that direction. For the most part, this is equivalent to the normal vector approach, but at the ends, the force will now be acting like radially outwards. Okay, that looks much better. We can see that the atoms are now properly repelled at the tips. And now that we can create a line, we can basically create any shape we want. So let's start with a simple cycle for our heat pump. Adding an expansion valve is also pretty straightforward now. We just need 2 more lines. The pump is a bit more tricky, but nothing we can solve with adding yet another line, this time a moving one. Maybe that's a bit fast, but that's much better. And I think we can make this even more effective with just a few more lines. Now, the last thing we need before we can see if this actually works are these heat exchange areas. And then I hope that in the cold area, in this area, the atoms become slower, which means they're colder. And in this area, the atoms become faster, which means that they're hotter. The problem is our current type of barrier does not allow for heat transfer. No matter how fast the atoms bang against the wall on one side, these kicks are not transmitted to the atoms on the other side. My idea how we could fix that is that we could build these heat exchange walls more like real walls are actually built from atoms. Okay, that's an interesting wave going on. It's because the lowest atom bounces off the line segment and then pushes the other atoms above. That's exactly how sound is transmitted. But anyway, we have to fix the atoms in place somehow for this wall to hold anything. We can restrain them with harmonic potentials. It's like they're fixed with springs to their starting locations. That works kind of well, but I guess we have to fine-tune the spring constants a bit. I think tighter springs might work for a tighter wall. Okay, that's still not perfect. Maybe double walls do the trick. After fiddling around with the parameters for a while, I ended up cheating a bit. No matter what I did, the double walls were still leaking eventually. And I guess that makes sense because also a real life barrier, which is only 2 atom layer thin, would probably also not be very tight. The little hack that I found works really well is to combine my previous type of line barrier with the double wall of atoms. And then to exclude the wall atoms from the force calculation in the line barrier. And this way, the wall atoms are not obstructed by the line barrier, but whenever another atom should come in between the wall atoms, it will still be repelled by the line barrier. This way, we don't have to worry about atoms leaking through, but heat can still be transferred through the barrier. And now I think we finally have everything in place for our first test. So let's see if that works. Again, what I hope to see is atoms accelerating on one side and slowing down on the other. So the warming up on the left side definitely works. I guess that's no surprise because the pump wings hit and accelerate the atoms in that direction. But it seems like it's just getting warmer everywhere. These graphs show the average speed of the atoms in both compartments. And we can use that as an indicator of temperature in our simulation. The left part heats up very quickly, but also the right part heats up. If our heat pump was working correctly, it should extract heat from this side and pump it to the other side. We should not add heat here. I guess it's time to think more carefully about what is actually supposed to cause the cooling to happen in the first place. Why should the atoms even slow down on this side of the valve? You might have heard that a gas cools down when it expands. You know that from sprays like this deodorant, which are very cold at the exit. So does that mean that if I open the valve between these two chambers, the atoms will slow down? Pause the video if you want to think about it. Well, they don't. There are actually different kinds of expansions, and it's important to understand the difference between them. Here is a second kind of expansion. This piston is linked to a spring, which is currently in its neutral form. But as soon as the piston moves outwards, the spring will resist this movement and push the piston back in. So what do you think will happen when I unlock the piston? We can see that in this case, the atoms really slow down as the gas expands. Initially, it oscillates back and forth, but we can clearly see that as the gas expands, the atoms slow down. In this setup, the atoms have to do work. They have to fight to gain space, to push the piston outwards against the force of this spring pushing inwards. So there is some place where the energy can go other than the atoms themselves. For such a spray, it's similar because the expanding gas has to push away the surrounding air, so it does work against ambient pressure. In this case, however, we call it a free expansion. There's nowhere for the energy to go, so how should it become colder? And the problem is, that looks pretty much exactly like the situation in our heat pump, doesn't it? And it becomes even worse because if we look closely, we can see that the atoms even become slightly faster, not slower. So how can that be? The thing is, currently the atoms in the simulation are purely repulsive. When two atoms approach each other, the total energy has to stay constant, but more and more of the kinetic energy is converted into potential energy. The atom slows down until it stops and then is pushed back to the other side. That means with purely repulsive atoms, the atoms are fastest when they are furthest apart. That's when most of the energy is in the form of kinetic energy. And now, when a lot of these kinds of atoms are crammed into a small box, there are always some of them currently banging into each other, so a fair amount of the energy is always stored as potential energy. Sometimes more atoms are close to each other, sometimes fewer, and that's what causes these fluctuations. But now, if we open this valve, on average, fewer atoms will be close together. And that means less of the energy is stored as potential energy. There's more kinetic energy, so the atoms are faster. The effect is quite subtle here, but I think you can still clearly see the difference before and after the valve was opened. So a gas that is dominated by repulsive forces will actually heat up when it expands in a free expansion. That means as long as you don't have any other storages for the energy to flow into, like the spring in this example. Here, the sum of the kinetic energy and the potential energy of the atoms is no longer constant because we have this spring as an additional player. But in our heat pump, we don't have such a spring or the gas working against ambient pressure like in the spray can example. It's a closed system. And then I guess it's no wonder that the heat pump is not working if this repulsive gas is actually heating up when it expands. So for it to work, instead we need a gas that is dominated by attractive forces. And all real gases actually have repulsive and attractive forces. On a long range, two atoms don't feel much from each other. Then on some intermediate range, there are attractive forces. For example, London dispersion forces, which are caused by fluctuations in the electron cloud of the atoms, leading to momentary dipoles in one atom and induced dipoles in the other atom. And then we have electrostatic attraction between these dipoles. And on a very short range, the atoms then begin to overlap and they show a very strong repulsive force. And that means at constant energy, these kinds of atoms are fastest when they are at intermediate distances. That's when they have the least amount of potential energy and most kinetic energy. And they are comparatively slow when they are far apart. That means if we keep them in a small box where the atoms are close together, close to the minimum in potential energy, they should slow down when we open the valve. And if we wait a little, we can see that they do. The kinetic energy is going down and the potential energy is rising. Under these circumstances, the gas actually becomes colder as it expands, and that's what we need for our heat pump to work. As a side note, if we start with the same atoms but cramped together even more tightly, the atoms again heat up on expansion. Because if we force them together too much, we are on this side of the potential, where repulsive forces are dominant, and then an expansion actually releases potential energy again. If you were very observant, you might have spotted a little flaw in this simulation. In the moment where I remove the cap, the total energy goes down. And that is because there are these atoms pressed against this barrier, which involves a certain potential energy. And if I simply delete the barrier, I also delete a bit of the energy, which is of course unphysical. And we could think about better ways to do this, but let's not worry about it. The impact is anyway quite small compared to the effect that I'm trying to illustrate here. So back to the heat pump. So for the cooling to work, we have to aim for this middle ground where the atoms are close together but also not forcefully squeezed together too much. And that's when they have the least amount of potential energy and they have to climb up this hill in order to expand. So let's see how the heat pump works with this kind of interaction. We can see that now with these attractive forces at work, the atoms like to form groups and tend to swirl around each other. And let's again monitor the average speed as our indicator for the temperature on both sides. And now, as the heat pump moves more and more atoms over to the left side, we can see that the atoms come closer together, more and more into contact with each other. And that is what a liquid looks like on an atomic level. The atoms on the right tend to be separated from each other, and that's what a gas looks like. But we can also see some more liquid-like behavior on this side at the surface of this wall here. Okay, now the left side clearly becomes warmer, but also the right side heats up again. So there's clearly another problem that we need to address. I'm thinking maybe the cooling effect, the energy transfer from the right to the left side, is already there, but we can't see it because it's buried by some other effect. Maybe the left part heats up so quickly and then heat begins to leak over to the right side that this overpowers any cooling effect that we could observe. In a real-world application, these reservoirs would usually be huge in comparison to the heat pump itself. For example, if you run a fridge in your home, a fridge is also just a heat pump with an insulating box. Basically, your entire home is this reservoir. And sure, the heat pump in the fridge adds some heat to your home, but essentially the temperature of your home still stays constant because it's so big in comparison. Now, the realistic thing to do would be to also make this reservoir very big in the simulation, so it can take up a lot of energy before it heats up significantly. However, then we would spend most of our computational resources simulating thousands and thousands of atoms which are not really relevant for us, except for keeping the temperature constant. Actually, that's a very common problem in simulations, and there's a fix for it. We can implement a sort of artificial thermostat to keep the temperature constant in a part of the simulation. And there are various methods how to do that, and here I will go for a Langevin thermostat. In a Langevin thermostat, we introduce friction to the atoms in the affected area. And this friction constantly drains energy from the atoms. And additionally, we introduce random kicks to add energy back into the system. And this combination of removing energy with friction and adding energy with random kicks allows us to adjust the temperature to any value, hot or cold. Now, in this run, the thermostat is only active in this area. Everywhere else, everything is just like it was before. And now with this thermostat activated, we should see that even though the pump is hitting and accelerating the atoms in this direction, the average speed and with that the temperature in this compartment should still stay constant. And let's keep this running for a while. And finally, we can see that the right side cools down. It's not a very strong effect. I think I've built a terribly inefficient heat pump, and we should talk about why it is so inefficient later. But first I want to see whether we can get a better insight on where and why exactly the cooling is happening. And therefore I created this map of how the kinetic energy is distributed, and this map of how the potential energy is distributed. So in this analysis we averaged the kinetic energies of the atoms in each patch over the course of the simulation. And in this map we do the same for their potential energy. In this area behind the pump we can see the highest values of kinetic energy, and that's not surprising because the atoms get hit and accelerated by the blades of the pump. But if we look at the potential energy map, we can see a second reason why the atoms are faster in this area. Coming from here, the potential energy of the atoms goes down. Here, they are still on average quite far apart, and when they come closer to each other, the potential energy goes down. And this energy can't just vanish, it has to go somewhere. And as these atoms attract each other while they come closer, they accelerate. And that's the second reason why we have high kinetic energy here. And now in this area, these fast hot atoms come into contact with the atoms of this reservoir. And because they are faster compared to the atoms in the reservoir, when they slam into this wall, they tend to transmit more kinetic energy over to this side compared to how much energy they get from the comparatively slow atoms on the other side. And this equilibrates to a point where the atoms have the same kinetic energy on both sides of this wall. But crucially, the potential energy is still low because they're still close together. So at the end of this heat exchanger passage, we still have low potential energy and sort of medium kinetic energy. And now comes the part where the magic is happening. Once released through this valve, the atoms tend to be further apart again. They have higher potential energy, and this energy has to come from somewhere, and that's why they have to have lower kinetic energy. They slow down as they overcome the attractive forces between them. The atoms cool down. Initially, I expected to find the lowest kinetic energies directly behind the valve. But actually we can see that the kinetic energy is lowest right before the pump. And I thought this must be some artifact or a bug in my simulation. But actually now I think it might be a very realistic behavior. From what I read, in real-life heat pumps, the refrigerant doesn't entirely evaporate directly at the valve either. Instead, there's a coexistence of liquid and gas behind the valve, and only by taking up additional energy from the heat exchanger, the rest of the liquid is able to evaporate. And that's actually pretty much exactly what we see in the simulation. Most of the time there are separated atoms gas, but also some droplets of liquid hanging out in this corner up here. And the refrigerant only completely evaporates once it reaches the pump down here. So overall how a heat pump works is, first we bring the atoms close together, and because they attract each other while they come closer, they are now higher in kinetic energy, but low in potential energy. And these fast atoms then bang against the heat exchanger and transfer some of their kinetic energy into this reservoir. So now we have medium kinetic energy and still low potential energy. And then we release them through the valve. We give them more space and they move apart against the attractive forces between them, and they slow down. So we convert kinetic energy into potential energy. And now the atoms can take up kinetic energy from the now comparatively faster moving atoms in this reservoir. At the beginning of this heat exchanger passage, we still have a mix of gas and liquid. But as the atoms take up more kinetic energy from this reservoir, more of the atoms can overcome the attractive forces between them, and we end up with mainly gas, mainly separated atoms, which have an even higher potential energy. So the kinetic energy extracted here is directly converted into more potential energy, which keeps the temperature low. And then the cycle starts over. We again bring the atoms close together to kind of squeeze out the energy that we just extracted from the other side. And now, of course, all of this doesn't come for free. There's an additional flow of energy. As mentioned before, the blades of the compressor hitting the atoms also adds energy into the system. And now is the moment of truth. How good of a heat pump did I build? How efficient is it? Real-world heat pumps can easily reach a coefficient of performance of 4 or something like that, which means that they provide 4 parts of heat for 1 part of energy introduced by the compressor. And that means 3 parts of the energy have to be extracted from this side. And to measure the performance, I added an additional thermostat to the right reservoir and set it to the same temperature as the thermostat on the left. And I also updated my thermostat code to keep track of how much energy is added or removed. So this graph here shows how much energy was removed from the thermostat on this side to keep the temperature constant. And this graph shows how much energy was added on this side to keep the temperature constant here. And if you subtract this side from the absolute value of that side, then that's the energy added by the compressor, by the blades hitting the atoms, because that's the amount of heat that ended up on the left but was not extracted from the right. And then all we have to do is to divide the amount of heat removed from the left side by the energy added through the compressor, and that gives us the coefficient of performance. We can also see that in the beginning, the thermostat on the right has to add more energy than later on to keep the temperature constant. And that's because we start the simulation with an equal amount of atoms on both sides. And that means in the beginning, more atoms can be pumped away from the right side, and therefore more cooling happens. So for my analysis, I discarded this initial part. And then the coefficient of performance is, certainly not the most efficient heat pump ever built. And I have a couple of ideas why this is the case. For one, the pipes are really narrow. They are just a few atom diameters wide, which means they are maybe a nanometer wide. And the narrower the pipes are, the harder the compressor has to work to push the atoms through the cycle. Another factor is the speed at which the compressor runs. The faster these blades move, the more energy is introduced into the system as these blades collide with the atoms. And I think a more efficient compressor would have to go for slower moving blades with lots of space in between to move a lot of atoms in one go. Now, we could explore these and other factors to improve the efficiency of the heat pump, but I think that leads too far for this video. If this video helped you to gain a firm understanding of the basic principle why a heat pump works, then that would already really make me happy, and let me know how it worked for you in the comments. I really love to read your comments. And thank you so much for your support also on Patreon, and see you next time.